Salvatore Riina. For 23 years, Salvatore Riina was a ghost. He moved through Sicily under false names, gave orders that reshaped an entire criminal empire, and left almost nothing for the authorities to follow. When they finally arrested him in the heart of Palermo, in early 1993, prosecutors would go on to hold him responsible for ordering the deaths of more than 150 people. He had come from almost nothing. Riina was born in the town of Corleone in November of 1930, into a poor farming family that lost his father and a younger brother to an accident with leftover wartime explosives. By his late teens, he had already taken a life and served time for it. When he came out, he attached himself to the rising Corleonesi clan, and from 1969 onward, after being indicted on a homicide charge, he simply disappeared from official view. From the shadows, Riina did not just lead the Corleonesi. He remade the Sicilian Mafia in his own image. He instigated what became known as the Second Mafia War in the early 1980s, a campaign that eliminated his rivals and left him the single most powerful figure in Cosa Nostra, the man other bosses referred to as the boss of all bosses. But Riina's ambition did not stop at the underworld. He decided the organization should confront the Italian state directly. In 1992, that decision turned catastrophic. In March, gunmen took the life of Salvo Lima, a powerful Sicilian politician and member of the European Parliament, who had long been seen as the link between the Mafia and Rome. Then, in May, an enormous explosion tore apart a stretch of motorway near the town of Capaci, ending the life of the anti-mafia magistrate Giovanni Falcone, along with his wife, Francesca Morvillo, and 3 of his police escorts. 2 months later, another blast on Via D'Amelio in Palermo took the life of Falcone's close colleague Paolo Borsellino and 5 more officers. According to a mafia informant who later testified, Riina had marked Falcone's death by opening champagne. So how do you finally catch a man who has evaded the law for more than 2 decades? The answer came from inside the organization. A former driver and mafia associate named Baldassare Di Maggio turned state's witness and led investigators to a quiet residential district of Palermo. On the 15th of January, 1993, a special unit of the Carabinieri, led by an officer who went only by the code name Ultimo, stopped Riina's car and arrested him without a shot being fired. After 23 years as a fugitive, he had been hiding in plain sight in the very city he had terrorized. The legal reckoning was immense. Riina had already been convicted in absentia at the landmark Maxi trial of the mid-1980s, the sprawling prosecution that had convicted hundreds of mafiosi at once. Now the courts came for him directly. He was convicted as the instigator of the Capaci bombing, of the attack on Via D'Amelio, of the Lima assassination, and of dozens of other deaths. By the end, he was serving 26 life sentences. That is not a typo. He spent his final years under the 41 bis regime, Italy's hardest form of imprisonment, designed specifically to cut a jailed boss off from his organization on the outside. Even from that isolation, he did not soften. In 2013, prison recordings captured him speaking with satisfaction about an earlier attack on a magistrate and quietly plotting the death of a prosecutor who was still pursuing him from behind bars. He never expressed a word of remorse. Salvatore Riina died on the 17th of November, 2017, in the prison ward of a hospital in Parma, one day after his 87th birthday. The man who had spent 23 years as a ghost passed his final years as one of the most closely guarded prisoners in the country, and he took the full truth of what he had ordered with him. But arresting the man they called the Beast did not decapitate Cosa Nostra the way Italy had hoped. Because standing quietly in the background was another son of Corleone, a man who had already spent decades perfecting the one skill Rana had just lost forever: the ability to never be found. Bernardo Provenzano. For 43 years, the Italian authorities could not decide whether Bernardo Provenzano was a criminal mastermind or a dead man. Some investigators quietly assumed he had passed away decades earlier. In reality, he had spent that entire time hiding in the Sicilian countryside, running one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world, using nothing more than tiny folded notes passed from hand to hand. Provenzano was born in Corleone in 1933, 3 years after Raina, and the two rose together. In his younger days, he earned a fearsome nickname that translated roughly to the Tractor, because, as one associate put it, he flattened everyone in his path. He was one of the gunmen in a notorious clan feud in the late 1950s and took part in a Palermo shooting in 1969. A warrant went out for him in 1963. He would not be seen in custody again for more than 4 decades. But somewhere along the way, the Tractor became something else. As Rina's wars brought the full weight of the state crashing down on the Mafia, Provenzano took over and chose the opposite path. He picked up a second nickname, the Accountant, for his quiet, managerial style. He abandoned Rina's campaign of bombings in favor of what became known as the Pax Mafiosa, a deliberate return to silence and invisibility, keeping the organization alive by keeping it out of the headlines. He ran the whole enterprise through what Sicilians called pizzini, small slips of paper folded into tight squares, sealed with tape, and carried between hideouts by trusted couriers. Provenzano wrote his orders in a simple substitution code, a variation on the ancient cipher once used by Roman commanders, shifting each letter a fixed number of places and numbering people instead of naming them. He never once used a telephone. From those notes, he settled disputes, approved appointments, and collected tribute from across Sicily and beyond. When police finally searched his refuge, they recovered around 350 of these notes. And no, that is not an exaggeration. An empire that stretched across Sicily was being governed on scraps of paper. So how do you catch a man who leaves no digital trail, makes no calls, and trusts almost no one? You follow the laundry. His warrant dated back to 1963, issued after a failed hit went wrong, and in the years since he had drifted from a grand 18th-century villa near Palermo to a string of increasingly humble hideouts. Investigators eventually tracked a delivery of clean clothes from Provenzano's family out to a remote farmhouse in the hills near Corleone. On the 11th of April, 2006, officers from a specialized Palermo capture unit, built for exactly this kind of long hunt, closed in. Their commander later described the moment their eyes met, saying Provenzano clearly had not been expecting them, and that his expression settled into something like resignation, an acknowledgement that his years on the run were finally over. He had been living in a modest shepherd's dwelling, surviving on plain food and boiled vegetables for his failing health. For 43 years, he had lived quietly among ordinary people in the Sicilian countryside. By the time of his arrest, Provenzano had already been convicted in absentia and handed multiple life sentences, including for his role in the massacres of the early 1990s. Italy's interior minister announced that Cosa Nostra had, without question, been decapitated. Provenzano, too, was placed under the 41 bis regime. But unlike Raina, he gave the courts almost nothing. His health declined quickly, and the man who had governed the Mafia through written notes slipped into a silence that was, this time, permanent. Bernardo Provenzano died on the 13th of July, 2016, in the prison wing of a Milan hospital, at the age of 83. He remains one of the longest hidden fugitives in modern European history, a man who ran an empire for over a decade while much of the country assumed he no longer existed. Provenzano had survived by choosing patience over violence. And a younger boss, one who had come up under Riena and studied Provenzano's gift for vanishing, would take that same instinct and stretch it to a length no one thought possible. He would stay hidden not for 11 years, not for 23, but for 3 full decades. Matteo Messina Denaro. He was meant to be the future of the Sicilian Mafia, a young, sharp-dressed boss with a taste for luxury and violence in equal measure. Then, in 1993, Matteo Messina Denaro vanished, and he stayed gone for 30 years. During that time, he became the most wanted man in Italy and, by some estimates, one of the wealthiest criminals in Europe. Messina Denaro was born in 1962 in Castelvetrano, in western Sicily, the son of a local mafia boss. He was a protégé of Riena, groomed inside the organization from a young age, and he cultivated an almost cinematic image that earned him the nickname Diabolic, after a comic book criminal. But beneath the designer sunglasses was one of the most violent figures of his generation. He once boasted that he had ended enough lives to fill a cemetery. He was deep inside the campaign of terror that defined the early 1990s. Courts convicted him as one of the instigators of the 1992 bombings that took the lives of the magistrates Falcone and Borsellino. He helped coordinate the mainland attacks of 1993, bombings in Florence, Rome, and Milan that took 10 lives between them, and he was convicted for his role in one of the crimes that most horrified the Italian public: the abduction of the young son of a mafia informant. The child had been taken to pressure his father into staying silent. He was held in captivity for more than 2 years before his life was taken, in an act that court filings later described as cold and deliberate. When the scope of it emerged, it turned ordinary Sicilians against the organization in a way the deaths of officials never quite had. A court handed Messina Denaro a life sentence for his part in it in 2012, one of many verdicts delivered while he was still a fugitive, tried in courtroom after courtroom without ever being present to hear the words. So how does the most hunted man in Italy stay free for 30 years? Money and loyalty. Investigators believe a tight network of relatives and associates around his home province of Trapani sheltered him and moved his fortune for decades, closing ranks so completely that 30 years of manhunts kept coming up empty. And that fortune was staggering. At the time of his eventual capture, his assets were estimated at around 4 billion euros. That is the kind of figure normally attached to corporations, not fugitives. The end, when it came, was almost quiet. Messina Denaro had developed colon cancer, and in January of 2023, investigators traced a patient receiving chemotherapy at a private clinic in Palermo under the false name Andrea Buonafede. On the 16th of January, more than 100 officers moved in and arrested him in the waiting room. He confirmed his real identity almost immediately. After 30 years, the last great fugitive of the Sicilian Mafia had been found sitting in a clinic just a few hours from the town where he was born. In the months that followed, relatives and associates who had helped hide him and secure his medical care were arrested as well, exposing at last the small circle that had kept him invisible for 3 decades. He had already been sentenced, in absentia, to roughly 20 life terms. Now he faced them in person, under the 41 bis regime. Italy's chief anti-mafia prosecutor in Palermo described him as the last of the men who had masterminded the massacres, the final living link to the terror of the early 1990s. Matteo Messina Denaro died on the 25th of September, 2023, in a prison hospital in L'Aquila, just months after his arrest, at the age of 61. But the search he left behind is far from over. As recently as May of 2026, Italian financial police seized more than 200 million euros in assets linked to him, scattered across countries from Andorra and Monaco to Switzerland and Lebanon. The man is gone. The money is still being hunted, tucked away in shell companies and foreign accounts that investigators are only now beginning to unravel, one country at a time. Messina Denaro was often called the last of the massacre masterminds, but he was not the one who had pushed hardest for that campaign of open war. That role belonged to a man tied to Riina not only by loyalty, but by blood and marriage. A man who wanted the bombings to continue long after others wanted them to stop. Leoluca Bagarella. While one faction of the Sicilian Mafia wanted to disappear quietly from the headlines, Leoluca Bagarella wanted the exact opposite. He believed the only way to survive was to wage open war on the Italian state itself. And for a short, terrifying stretch in the mid-1990s, that is very nearly what he did. Bagarella was born in Corleone in 1942, into the same clan that produced Riina and Provenzano. His bond to Riina was personal. Riina married Bagarella's sister, which made the two men brothers-in-law, and it is how Bagarella came to be known throughout the organization. He was not a background strategist. He was a hands-on enforcer, and one of the most feared figures the Corleonesi ever produced. His record of violence was direct and personal. In 1979, Bagarella took the life of the investigative journalist Mario Francese, who had been reporting on the Corleonesi and their rise. That same year, he took the life of Boris Giuliano, the head of the Palermo flying squad, and one of the most capable investigators pursuing the mafia at the time. Francese was a reporter who had simply gotten too close to the truth. Giuliano was a policeman closing in fast. But it was after Riina's arrest in 1993 that Bagarella became something even more dangerous. Many in Italy assumed that capturing Riina had broken the organization's back. Bagarella set out to prove them wrong. As Provenzano argued for silence and retreat, Bagarella led the opposing faction, the one that wanted the war with the state to escalate rather than end. He became a principal architect of the 1993 bombing campaign on the Italian mainland. In one attack that May, a car bomb detonated beside the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. 5 people lost their lives, among them 2 children of a single family. That summer, further bombings struck Rome and Milan, aimed at churches and monuments, as the mafia tried to force the state into backing down through sheer terror. The goal was blunt: to punish Italy for the crackdown that followed the 1992 assassinations, and to pressure the government into softening the harsh prison conditions being imposed on jailed bosses. It was, in effect, a bombing campaign designed to bully a nation into surrender. But what does justice even look like for someone accused of harm on that scale? For Bagarella, it looked like a stack of sentences almost too large to comprehend. He was arrested on the 24th of June, 1995, in a suburb of Palermo, driving alone and unarmed. When investigators searched a property connected to him, they found a cache of weapons and a room they described as a chamber used to interrogate enemies. In the courts, the verdicts piled up. Bagarella was ultimately handed 13 life sentences, along with an additional term of more than 100 years, several of them to be served in solitary confinement, and he was placed under the 41 bis regime. In the trial over the Francese assassination, the entire leadership of the organization was convicted alongside him. And as late as 2018, courts were still adding further years to his punishment. He remained defiant to the last. When Provenzano had objected to the bombings, Bagarella reportedly told him, with heavy sarcasm, that he might as well wear a sign announcing he had nothing to do with the massacres. At least one senior investigator came to believe that most of the Mafia's assassins in that period answered directly to Bagarella, which would have made him, for a time, more powerful in practice than the man who officially succeeded Reina. With his capture, the faction that had wanted endless war lost its driving force. Provenzano's quieter strategy won out by default, and the campaign of bombings that had terrified the country came, almost overnight, to an end. As of 2026, Leoluca Bagarella is still alive and still incarcerated, held under the same hard prison regime, serving sentences that ensure he will never walk free. Of the architects of the early 1990s terror, he is among the last still drawing breath behind bars. The Corleonesi drew their strength from western Sicily, from Palermo and the hills around Corleone. But their reach stretched clear across the island, to the eastern city of Catania, where a very different kind of boss had built a power base of his own, one wrapped carefully in the language of respectability. Benedetto Santapaola. In the coastal city of Catania, on the far side of Sicily from Corleone, Benedetto Santapaola built a criminal dynasty that outsiders barely understood. He reached the top by turning on the very man who had mentored him. And for years, the respectable face of the city, its businessmen and its officials, quietly did business with him anyway. Santapaola was born in a working-class district of Catania in 1938. He was known as the Hunter, a nickname drawn from his passion for shooting game, and he allied his Catania organization closely with the Corleonesi in Palermo. In 1978, he seized control of the local mafia by taking the life of his own boss, Giuseppe Calderone, with the backing of Riena's faction. From then on, Catania belonged to him. Santapaola's power rested on a partnership between organized crime, business, and politics that the journalist Giuseppe Fava had spent his career exposing. Fava, the founder of a fearless Sicilian magazine, was assassinated in January of 1984. Years later, a nephew of Santapaola who had turned informant confessed that the order had come from Santapaola himself. You'd think someone would have said something long before that. Nobody did. His organization dominated the construction, extortion, and protection rackets of eastern Sicily, and his reach extended well beyond Catania. Santapaola sent a team of his men to Palermo to carry out the 1982 attack that took the life of General Carlo Alberto Dalla Chiesa, a decorated officer who had been sent to Sicily as prefect for the express purpose of fighting the mafia. He had been in the post barely 100 days. His wife and their escort lost their lives in the same attack, and like the other bosses on this list, Santapaola was later convicted as an instigator of the 1992 bombings that ended the lives of the magistrates Falcone and Borsellino. So how do you prosecute a man whose orders were always carried out by other hands? Through the testimony of the very people who had once served him. Santapaola spent 11 years as a fugitive, moving through the countryside around Catania while continuing to run his organization from hiding, before officers, in an operation codenamed Full Moon, arrested him in a farmhouse near the city in May of 1993. He had remained close to home the entire time, protected by a network of loyalists in the territory he had controlled for so long. His capture came as part of the wave of arrests that followed the 1992 massacres, when a shaken Italian state finally turned the full force of its institutions against the organization. In court, the informants who had once been his soldiers became the state's witnesses. He was convicted, over a series of trials, of ordering the Fava assassination and of his role in the massacres of the early 90s. The verdict for Fava's death became definitive only in 2003, nearly 2 decades after the journalist was silenced for exposing the network of powerful Catania businessmen who prospered under Santa Paola's protection. In the end, Santa Paola accumulated 18 life sentences and was held, from his arrest until his death, under the 41 bis regime. Fava had famously written about a handful of untouchable Catania businessmen he accused of prospering hand-in-hand with the mafia, and it was that reporting, naming names the city preferred to leave unspoken, that likely cost him his life. The retaliation would in time reach Santa Paola's own family. In 1995, his wife, Carmela Minniti, lost her life in an act of revenge tied to the mafia's internal wars, and the son of the journalist he had ordered silenced, himself a politician, would later describe Santa Paola as the silent priest of Catania's system of power, the quiet figure sitting at the center of everything. Benedetto Santa Paola died on the 2nd of March, 2026, in a prison in Milan at the age of 87, of natural causes, with an autopsy ordered as a matter of routine. He had spent his final 33 years in custody, and he took to his grave the full extent of what the city of Catania had allowed to happen under his rule. The bosses so far had waged their wars almost entirely inside Italy, but the reach of the Sicilian Mafia had never stopped at the water's edge. One of its most powerful figures built a fortune that spanned an ocean, moving his product through the last kind of storefront anyone would ever suspect. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Gaetano Badalamenti. Nearly every man on this list waged his war inside Italy. Gaetano Badalamenti built an empire that reached across an ocean. For close to a decade, he moved an estimated $1.5 billion in heroin into the United States. And he did it by hiding the operation inside the most ordinary storefront imaginable, the neighborhood pizzeria. Badalamenti was born in 1923 in the town of Cinisi, near Palermo, and he rose to the very top of the Sicilian Mafia. By the mid-1970s, he headed the organization's ruling commission, the body that arbitrated disputes between the families and approved its most important decisions. He was known simply as Don Tano, a man of the old school who looked down on the crude brutality of the rising Corleonesi. But in 1978, they forced him out of the commission and marked him for death, and he fled Sicily, first to Spain and then across the Atlantic to Brazil. His expulsion was one of the opening moves in the long internal struggle that would eventually leave Rina's faction in control of everything. His masterwork was the operation that American investigators would come to call the Pizza Connection. Between the mid-1970s and the mid-1980s, Badalamenti's network imported an estimated $1.5 billion in heroin from Asia into the United States, using a chain of pizzerias across the American Northeast as fronts to distribute the drugs and launder the enormous profits. Raw morphine base was refined in secret Sicilian laboratories, smuggled across the Atlantic, and sold out of ordinary storefronts where families were lining up for a slice. $1.5 billion in heroin, sold through pizza parlors. That is the entire scheme in a single sentence. Even after he fled to Brazil, Badalamenti continued to direct the flow of product and money from a distance. A boss without a country, still running one of the largest heroin pipelines the world had ever seen. Back home in Cinisi, his name was tied to a quieter crime. In 1978, a young local activist named Giuseppe Impastato, who had spent years publicly mocking and exposing Badalamenti's operation over a small radio station, lost his life in a staged explosion designed to look like an accident. His story would later inspire a celebrated film, The 100 Steps, named for the short distance between the Impastato family home and Badalamenti's own front door. Impastato's brother later told an anti-mafia commission that he had often watched local police walking arm in arm with Badalamenti and his men, and that no one could keep faith in institutions that behaved that way. So how does a Sicilian boss end up standing trial in a courtroom in New York? Through a joint effort between Italian and American authorities that spanned 2 continents and years of wiretaps. Badalamenti was arrested in Madrid in April of 1984, together with his son and a nephew, and was extradited to the United States that November. What followed was, at the time, the longest criminal trial in American history. A 17-month proceeding in a New York federal court, prosecuted by an office that included future household names in American law enforcement. More than a dozen defendants sat in the dock at once, and the evidence ran to years of wiretapped calls in which Badalamenti and his associates arranged shipments in a thin code of their own. It ended in the spring of 1987 with 18 convictions. Badalamenti was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison and fined $125,000. He never cooperated with the authorities and never showed a trace of regret. Years later, back in Italy, the courts caught up with him for the Impastato case as well, sentencing him to life in 2002 for ordering the young activist's death. The Pizza Connection case, meanwhile, had permanently changed how American and Italian investigators worked together against organized crime, opening a channel of cooperation that would help bring down many of the bosses who came after him. Gaetano Badalamenti never returned to Cinisi. He died on the 29th of April 2004 of heart failure inside a federal medical prison in Massachusetts at the age of 80. The boss, who had once run a billion-dollar pipeline across the Atlantic, spent his final years thousands of miles from the 100 steps where his story had begun, in the custody of the very country he had helped flood with heroin. Badalamenti had once presided over the Mafia's ruling commission, until the Corleonesi pushed him aside. The man who came to lead that commission through its bloodiest years carried his authority in a very different way, less like a gangster and more like a man of the cloth. Michele Greco. They called him the Pope. Michele Greco was not a street brawler or a hands-on enforcer. He was a mediator, a wealthy landowner who hosted mafia summits on his sprawling estate and settled disputes between warring families with a few soft, measured words. And during the years he presided over the Sicilian Mafia's ruling commission, more blood was spilled than in almost any period in its history. Greco was born in 1924 in Ciaculli, on the outskirts of Palermo, into a family that had been steeped in the Mafia for generations. He earned his nickname, the Pope, for his talent at mediation, his ability to bless an alliance or grant a kind of absolution to a rival. He and his brother, a figure powerful enough to be nicknamed the Senator, cultivated ties to businessmen, magistrates, and officials, some of them through secret Masonic lodges. His country estate in the citrus groves outside Palermo became neutral ground, where the bosses of Cosa Nostra gathered to carve up their world, a place where fortunes were divided and death sentences were quietly approved over long lunches. But the Pope's blessings came at a terrible cost. As head of the commission in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Greco presided over the wave of violence that carried the Corleonesi to power, a campaign that claimed rivals, investigators, magistrates, and officials alike. Among the deaths later laid at his feet was the 1983 car bombing that took the life of the anti-mafia magistrate Rocco Chinnici, along with 2 of his bodyguards and a resident who happened to be passing by. It was one of the first times the Sicilian Mafia had used a car bomb against a magistrate, a chilling preview of the tactics that would define the following decade. But how do you convict a man who had spent his whole life making sure no order could ever be traced back to him? The answer was the Maxi trial, the vast prosecution built largely on the testimony of the first great mafia informants. Greco had gone into hiding in the early 1980s, carrying the identity papers of a man who had already died, moving between safe houses while the case against him took shape. But in February of 1986, just 10 days into that historic proceeding, police found him at a farmhouse near Palermo and brought him into the courtroom to answer the charges alongside hundreds of his associates. For a man who had spent his life avoiding any direct connection to a crime, being placed in the dock at the largest mafia trial ever held was a reversal few had thought possible. When the verdicts came at the end of 1987, Greco was found guilty of 78 counts of homicide and sentenced to life. The trial itself was staged inside a specially built bunker courtroom attached to a Palermo prison, and it ended with hundreds of convictions in a single sweep. Greco's conviction was upheld by Italy's highest court in 1992, the very ruling that enraged the Corleonesi and set the massacres of that year in motion, and additional life sentences followed in the years after. He never once admitted his guilt. In his closing statement at the Maxi trial, Greco turned to the presiding judge and wished him peace and serenity of spirit, saying that serenity was the essential condition for passing fair judgment, words that everyone in the room understood as a veiled threat. A historian later called him the very archetype of a mafia boss, unsmiling and given to speaking only in riddles and parables. As late as 2007, in a letter written from his cell, Greco insisted that he was as innocent as a newborn child. Michel Greco died on the 13th of February 2008 in a prison in Rome, at the age of 83, still protesting his innocence to the very end. The man who had blessed a generation of bloodshed with a few gentle words went to his grave without ever acknowledging a single one of them. Greco gave the commission its dignified priestly mask. But the true engine behind the violence of that era had been assembled years earlier, in Corleone itself, by the man who trained Riina and Provenzano and set the entire machine in motion. Luciano Liggio. Before Riina, before Provenzano, there was Luciano Liggio. He was the man who built the Corleonesi from a small-town clan into the force that would one day dominate all of Sicily, and he personally trained the two protégés who would finish what he started. For decades, everyone knew exactly what he was, and for decades, the law could not lay a finger on him. Liggio was born in Corleone in 1925. His real family name was Leggio. The spelling that followed him for the rest of his life came from a mistake in a court document. As a young man, he seized control of the Corleone clan in 1958 by taking the life of the local mafia boss, a physician named Michel Navarra. The two had once been allies, until Navarra reportedly tried to have the ambitious young Liggio eliminated. Liggio survived the attempt and answered it by removing Navarra permanently. From there, he began his climb. He insisted on being called the professor, though he had left school at the age of 9 and remained barely able to read well into adulthood. One informant recalled that Liggio would sit at mafia meetings correcting the grammar of far better educated men. His methods were both brutal and businesslike. He ordered a notorious 1969 massacre in the center of Palermo, part of an attempt to wipe out a rival family in a single stroke. And from a base in the northern city of Milan, Liggio ran a lucrative kidnapping ring that seized wealthy industrialists in the prosperous north and held them for enormous ransoms, money that helped bankroll the Corleoneses' rise. Among his documented victims were a manufacturer taken in 1972 and a Turin executive abducted the following year, a case that would eventually help lead the authorities straight to him. The ransoms ran into the equivalent of millions, and the operation was industrial in its scale and coldness, treating human beings as commodities to be traded back to their families for cash. His long run of slipping through their fingers earned him a nickname borrowed from fiction, casting him as an elusive phantom who always vanished just as the law closed in. What few outsiders knew was that this feared boss suffered from a crippling bone disease that left him in constant pain, a frailty he hid behind an iron reputation. So how does a man everyone knew was guilty stay beyond the reach of the law for so long? For years, the answer was fear and the silence it purchased. Through the 1960s, Liggio was hauled before the courts more than once and walked free each time, as witnesses recanted or vanished, and evidence had a way of evaporating before it could ever reach a verdict. In that era, the Sicilian Mafia could still make an entire prosecution collapse simply by frightening everyone who might testify, and Liggio became the living proof of it. But the kidnappings drew heat that even Liggio could not shake off. In May of 1974, Italy's financial police tracked him to an apartment in Milan and captured him there, the untouchable phantom cornered at last in a northern city far from home. The following year, he was sentenced to life for taking Navarra's life. And somehow, it got worse. From behind bars, Liggio simply kept running the Corleonesi, issuing his orders through Riina and Provenzano, who governed the clan in his name for years. When he finally stood trial alongside the others at the Maxi trial, the jury acquitted him for lack of evidence, rejecting the prosecution's request to add still more years to his sentence. It was a fitting end to a career built on the principle that no charge could ever quite be made to stick. Even locked away, he had remained the clan's founding authority, the shadow behind the two men now waging war on the state in his name. Luciano Liggio died on the 15th of November, 1993, of a heart attack, inside a prison in Sardinia at the age of 68. He never walked free again after 1974, yet the organization he founded carried on without him, exactly as he had designed it, run by the two students who had learned everything they knew at his side. Liggio had built the Corleonesi at the top, and his students carried it to its terrible peak. But by the early 1990s, the organization's most savage work was being done by a far younger generation, men who had come of age entirely inside the war that Liggio's protégés had unleashed. Giuseppe Graviano. By the early 1990s, the Sicilian Mafia had a new kind of soldier, young, cold, and completely devoted to the campaign of terror. Giuseppe Graviano, still in his 20s, ran the Brancaccio quarter of Palermo alongside his brother, and together they became the hands that carried out some of the organization's most shocking attacks. One of them would target a man who fought the Mafia not with a badge or a gun, but with a Sunday sermon. Graviano was born in Palermo in 1963. From 1990, he and his brother Filippo controlled the Brancaccio district, a poor, densely packed Mafia stronghold in the south of the city where the organization ran extortion, drugs, and daily life alike. They were young, but they were trusted with the organization's most sensitive and violent work. And they answered directly to the top of the Corleonesi hierarchy during the years of open war against the state. In a neighborhood the Mafia treated as its private property, the Graviano brothers were kings. Graviano helped coordinate the 1993 bombing campaign on the Italian mainland, the attacks in Florence, Rome, and Milan that took 10 lives and were meant to terrorize the country into backing down. The targets were deliberate. Art galleries, ancient churches, the cultural treasures of the nation itself, chosen to wound Italy's sense of who it was. It was terror aimed not just at people, but at a country's soul. But the crime most closely tied to his name struck much closer to home. In September of 1993, Graviano and his brother ordered the death of Father Pino Puglisi, a parish priest in Brancaccio, who had opened a community center for local children and had been steadily, stubbornly pulling the neighborhood's young people out of the mafia's reach. To the Graviano brothers, a priest teaching children there was a better life than the one the organization offered was not a nuisance. He was a threat to their entire hold on the district. Puglisi was targeted on the very day he turned 56. The man, later convicted of carrying out the attack, said the priest had turned to face the men who came for him and told them, quite calmly, that he had been expecting them. What does it take to bring down the men who tried to bomb a country into submission? For the Graviano brothers, it took only a matter of months. The two were arrested together in a Milan restaurant in January of 1994, less than a year after the mainland bombings, while living quietly under the noses of the authorities in the north. The verdicts came in separate trials over the following years. A court in Florence convicted Giuseppe Graviano and sentenced him to life for the 1993 attacks, and a court in Palermo handed down a second life sentence in 1999, naming him as an instigator of Father Puglisi's death. He has remained in prison ever since, held under the 41 bis regime. Years later, his name returned to the front pages for an entirely different reason. In 2009, a mafia informant testified in court that Graviano had once boasted of powerful political protection reaching the highest levels of Italian government. The prominent politician named in that testimony, a man who would later serve as prime minister, and his close associate both firmly denied any connection to the mafia, and no court has ever established that such a tie existed. The claims remain exactly that, unproven courtroom testimony that continues to fuel one of Italy's most enduring controversies. His brother Filippo was convicted and sentenced alongside him, and the two have spent the decades since behind bars. But it is Giuseppe whose name keeps resurfacing. In the years that followed, his scattered courtroom remarks and hints became central to a long-running Italian investigation into whether elements of the state had once negotiated with the mafia to end the bombings, a case that has divided the country's courts and its public for years. As of 2026, Giuseppe Graviano is still alive and still imprisoned, serving multiple life sentences. And from his cell, he has continued to make statements about the events of the early 1990s that keep the old questions about the mafia's dealings with the Italian state very much alive. For him, that particular story is not finished. The arrests of the Graviano brothers stripped the mafia of its youngest and most ruthless operatives. But even a wounded organization tries to grow a new head. And once Provenzano was finally taken, one man stood better placed than anyone to gather up the scattered pieces and rebuild. Salvatore Lo Piccolo. When Bernardo Provenzano was finally captured, a vacuum opened at the very top of the Sicilian Mafia, and Salvatore Lo Piccolo moved quietly to fill it. He had already been a fugitive for more than 20 years, rebuilding the organization from the shadows and even reaching back across the Atlantic to revive old ties with the American mafia. He was, by many accounts, the last man capable of putting Cosa Nostra back together again. Lo Piccolo was born in Palermo in 1942 and had been on the run since 1983, nearly a quarter of a century as a fugitive. Known as the Baron, he served for years as Provenzano's right hand in the city and rose to command one of its key districts. He worked to heal old wounds inside the organization and to bring back into the fold Sicilian Mafia families who had fled to the United States during the wars of the 1980s, reopening the transatlantic channels that had once made men like Badalamenti rich. In the coded notes the two men exchanged, Lo Piccolo signed himself simply as Number 30. When Provenzano fell in 2006, Lo Piccolo emerged as the leading candidate to become the next boss of all bosses, in quiet competition with the still-hidden Matteo Messina Denaro. His authority rested on decades of violence and a meticulous vision for the organization's future. When police finally raided his hideout, they discovered something remarkable: a typewritten code of conduct, a kind of mafia rulebook that the press quickly dubbed the 10 Commandments. And no, that is not made up. Its rules governed nearly every part of a member's life. A man could not introduce himself directly to another member. A third person had to vouch for him. He could not look at the wives of other members, could not be seen in the company of police, and had to be available to the organization at all times, no matter what. A written oath swore loyalty to Cosa Nostra and warned that any betrayal would be paid for in fire. So how do you stop a man who is quietly rebuilding an entire criminal organization from the ground up? You watch his family. Investigators located Lo Piccolo through a recent photograph of his son, and on the 5th of November, 2007, they raided a house near a village west of Palermo, capturing him along with his son Sandro in the middle of a mafia summit. The national anti-mafia prosecutor called him the only man capable of carrying on Provenzano's legacy, and officials described the arrest as a heavy blow, precisely because the Lo Piccolos had been charged with rebuilding the organization from within. The raid caught not only Lo Piccolo and his son, but a gathering of other figures, a summit of the very leadership he had been trying to rebuild. The courts eventually handed down a definitive life sentence over a 1979 disappearance, the case of a prison marshal who was taken and never seen again. One of those killings the mafia carried out so that no body would ever be found. That verdict was made final by Italy's highest court in 2017. Lo Piccolo and his son also received 30 years for taking the life of a Palermo businessman in 1999. His arrest was widely seen as settling the question of who would inherit Cosa Nostra after Provenzano, and settling it in the state's favor. With Lo Piccolo removed, there was no longer any single figure with the standing, the connections, and the will to pull the shattered organization back together into what it had once been. As of 2026, Salvatore Lo Piccolo remains alive and imprisoned, held under the 41 bis regime and serving a life sentence from which he will never be released. The man who had come closer than anyone to reassembling the Sicilian Mafia instead became one more name on the long list of bosses the Italian state finally managed to lock away for good. 10 men, 1 island, and half a century of fear that stretched from remote Sicilian villages all the way into the heart of the Italian state. Nearly every one of them died behind bars or remains there still, held under the hardest prison regime the country could devise, and the organization they once commanded has never regained the power it held in their time. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.